really, really good to be together with you all in 3D in this place. I sort of can't even believe it's happening, not to mention in honor of the son of Gloucester, Boston, Brooklyn, Jerusalem, and so on. Fierce, exhilarating, maddening, prolific, intellectual, polyglot, translator, poet, novelist, historian, critic, medievalist, award-winning teacher, and activist, etc. Ammiel Alcalay for the annual Charles Olson Memorial Lecture. This is the 11th year out of 12 of bringing, in tandem with the Cape Ann Museum, outlaw high wire acts to town to expand our capacity to live in reality, which is a specialty of Ammiel Alcalay, professor of Hebrew literature at Queens College and CUNY Graduate Center, who also teaches poetry workshops at Queens and CUNY's MFA program. But he thinks and writes about and helps make accessible to contemporary readers an array of 20th century and contemporary work from Bosnia, where his parents grew up before World War II, and the wide, diverse area he calls by its Renaissance name, bypassing present-day historical erasures and tragic boundaries, the Levant. And of course, he is an indispensable critic and social historian of American and US poetry, and a gatherer in his American Book Award-winning chapbook series from CUNY, Lost and Found, of literary remains from the crucial mid-century, when intellectually and spiritually ambitious American poets began to leave the path of historical delusion and violent individualism our country was on, a path leading to where we are today, and create loosely federated nations of their own, according to Alcalay, around small presses and magazines and in small cities like Gloucester that foster a critical mass of artists and writers. Their taste for reality and fraternity surrounded Alcalay as he grew up in a family of artists whose friends included Charles Olson. Alcalay remembers playing badminton with the towering poet at the age of 5. Formative experience, no doubt. His critical work has often taken the form of inspired exegesis of Olson's work, excavating, perpetuating, inhabiting the memory of this significant man and helping to transmit his deep, specific knowledge, very local, very global, of his place in his time and others, and the necessity of poetry for the conveyance of such disruptive knowledge as we must have to live right. As an apostle of Olson, he is, among his many cultural functions, an active member of what I call the advisory board of the Maud Olson Library. Olson critic Ralph Maud's astonishing recreation of the inside of Charles Olson's brain by collecting copies of every book he'd owned, read, quoted, or mentioned, and copying into those Olson's marginalia. Alcalay publishes with small, bold presses that keep their books in print and keeps these links evident in their lists. And since we are here by the grace of a museum, and the library, and the micronation of the Gloucester Writers Center, I'll end by briefly quoting Alcalay's book of forgotten historical connections and poetic contexts, A Little History. He was writing about how writers and cultural figures' letters get scattered among institutions after they die, quote, remaining unedited, unlinked, and out of touch with each other. The record of the work, as well as the coming together of people in common endeavor and friendship, is atomized, pulled apart, stored in separate containers, making it much harder for us to inhabit coherent stories, to make sense of ourselves, our history, and the times we live in. Ammiel Alcalay works continuously to reconnect times, places, people, moments of history and origin, and he has connected us to, after almost 2 years of isolation in a place we've lost, to hear what he'll link to what today. Thank you.
Okay, that's it, we can go home. I'm done. Wow, thank you, Mary, that was amazing. I just have this picture up here. There are a few others I'm going to show you. This is a picture that Ralph Mott actually gave me and said, quietly, because he didn't know who took it. Anyways, it's obviously Charles Olson, Allen Ginsberg, seemingly John Wiener's over there, and hard to say who's in that corner. And this is at a diner in Buffalo. But it's just such a striking image that I used it for this book, which, the title, and I think Mary got that very, very rightly so. It's a little bit of a play on a couple of things. It's like the Jewish joke, you want a little history? I'll give you a little history. It's also a little bit en petit testament, the villon, like just a little, but it isn't. Anyways, I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I wanted to just start by going back to, I think that, I'm not sure if Henry got it on the website yet or not, but in 1979, Robert Creeley instituted a series of lectures in Buffalo, Charles Olson lectures, and those ended in 1989. And the only two living remaining lecturers of that series are Duncan McNaughton and Ed Sanders. And Ed, of course, gave a lecture here. And I just wanted to go back to our series here, which began in 2010 and just to, remember those who have passed, which is quite, it's a hard place to start from, but I wanted to acknowledge that. So obviously Diane DePrima was a very dear friend, and I'm now one of her literary executors, which is, there's a lot of work to do. Diane also came with Mike Brumaker. Mike didn't give a lecture, but he gave a reading. And Mike obviously was a student of Charles's at Black Mountain and also passed. And I had the honor of introducing Amiri Baraka in 2013. Amiri passed. Ralph was not able to make it because he was already ill in 2014. And then in 2015, we had Michael McClure, who passed not so long ago. So these are kind of momentous losses, these are chunks of the world. And of course, right here, we had our dear Fred Buck and Garrett Lansing and Peter Anastas. All quite irreplaceable people. So, you know that, but I wanted it said for those who don't. So as I said, since I'm somebody who thinks a lot about history, it's a hard place to start from because so much is, truncated with the loss of these living people. And one of the insights that Charles Olson had when he went to the Yucatan was that the glyphs were connected to the living language of the people there. And that's something that he states over and over again, both in the letters to Robert Creeley, but also in an extraordinary application that he made for funding to the Jenner Wen Foundation, which you can actually read. It's online on El Chiringa magazine. It's an extraordinary document, actually. Anyways, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I'll just say, no one was harmed in the research for this lecture, not yet, at least. We'll see how that goes. I over-prepare for these things. I over-prepare, and then I kind of try to forget what I prepared, and then I just start talking. And luckily, I drove here, and that's very helpful. Driving is helpful to get. I went into hypnosis once with Kristen Prevalent to try to figure out why I'm better, in the subway or driving or walking. Very peripatetic thinker. And Kristen Prevalent is somebody we should have as an Olson lecturer, personally, I think. So what ends up happening, I remember hearing once an interview with Marcello Mastroianni, who was asked about how Fellini makes film scripts. And he just kind of shook his head and he said, well, usually it's like a napkin or the back of a piece of paper, and there's a drawing and a couple of, marks on it. And that's kind of what I ended up with. But I want to start with an audio which will take us back in time a little bit. And it's from one of the Buffalo lectures, the Ed Dorn lecture. Yeah, this is from 1981, Ed Dorn's third. Those lectures were done in a series of 3. So this is the 3rd lecture.
Claim anything, because frankly, there's not much left to claim. If you can claim something, you ought to. In Olson's time, and I take it really that 1970 was without making such a large claim for an actual transaction for a year, but say, taking its significance from the actual significance of his death, which was terminal to all the energy he had to give to argue sanity, rationality, morality, and excitement all at the same time. If indeed that did end, the greatest speaker for that condition, favorite word of his, then January 1970, in fact, did end something with his death, which was way beyond his mere death, obviously. I mean, everybody dies. The kind of vast and beautiful nostalgia which runs through most of the books of Maximus. It's a kind of a definition of a really dangerous demand on attentiveness. Like the idea that if you're not attentive, you're dead. The great poems, for instance, which speak of the lost fisherman as a class, and the throwing of the flowers on the water. The great kind of funereal exhortations to relate with human motion, not particular individuals. All fishermen were very particular, but the way we remember them is like their common tragedy and their common use. And the precise movement of property along the public property roads, where the houses were, who owned them, where they moved to. In other words, a kind of local record which possessed almost no inflation at all. No inflation at all. It was all attention. That kind of local, where the public record must be what to be a skull means. That's the exhortation to be beyond your poetry, to write poetry, not your own poetry. Nobody could ever care about that.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So I'm sure you might pick up on a bunch of key words there that I'm interested in. Inflation, of course, but also poetry versus your own poetry. And to think about, just to start thinking about the distance of that 50 years since 1970, 51 years. And, you know, the kind of, let me just get a little more comfortable. Much of what we witness, you know, the diminishment of things, the shoddiness of things, the control mechanisms, these are all things that would have been very familiar to Olson. Very predicted, very predictable from things that he was already thinking about and deeply involved in. And of course, you know, I reread in this weeks of coming up to this, I reread Peter Anastas's beautiful, brilliant preface to Charles's letters to the Gloucester Times, which still remains for me the best single overall introduction to Olson that we have. It's absolutely brilliant, and he's on to just about everything. And he's also testing it to the time that it was written in, and that's precisely what I want us to think about and where my talk is headed. because I always have to think about where we are, where we are now. And I want to start with the idea of, of information. Okay, information as, let's see, I have this neatly written somewhere. Communication and information. Communication as propaganda versus communication as empowerment, exploration, and kinship. Okay, and a really serious study of the power structures of the US will show the role of propaganda to be so central. And I would recommend everybody, if you've never read Edward Bernays' Propaganda, it's a key text to understanding how things actually operate. And it's very up to date. It's right with us. So finding out how to break through that is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult because our power centers are very diffuse. It's kind of like the arms industry. Every state makes widgets and so on and so forth, and they all get assembled somewhere. So that's the same with communication and propaganda and information. And this was something that, which I'll talk about towards the end, with a project of mine, which is bibliography. Something that Charles was very keyed into, particularly through his study of Brooks Adams. But, I want to just, put us where we are now. So for instance, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, during the first year of the pandemic, was writing these columns that alarmed a lot of people because the discourse of inquiry has been in many ways debunked by people one would think are one's allies, i.e., let's say the left, which has become quite authoritarian in various ways. And Agamben was asking some very central human questions, like, over the course of this time, if we don't mourn people, if we don't go to funerals, if we don't, if we can't be with loved ones as they die, what's going to happen to us? What is that doing to us? He was asking very simple questions. He wasn't particularly seeking answers. He was stating the obvious, like, what is going to happen after this period? How are we going to deal with it? What effect is it going to have on us? And I think we don't know yet. It's certainly going to have an effect. And during that whole period, I also, and have been constantly, I've been working with a young poet from Gaza, Mossab Abu Toba, and we've been Zooming a lot, because, that's what we do. And Gaza is a particular case because it's been under lockdown for like 14 years. So they know the drill, and, COVID hasn't been a particularly, it's a problem, but it's not on the top of the list over there. So that was a very useful perspective to have, being in constant communication with his friend and working on a project together and hearing what was going on day to day, besides, the May attack. But it put a lot of things for me in perspective, and it, made me, as I'm wont to do, try to figure out where we are and what that means in relationship to the past, because we constantly are reconstructing the past. We make the past. The past is in many ways ours to construct. And there is in the title. Henry asked me for a title, so I came up with a title. Obviously, I need a title for the thing. And this the title that I came up with, "A Hunger for Grandeur." I didn't exactly know what I was thinking, but the more I thought about it, I thought, well, yes, there is. I mentioned I feel we're quite diminished these days, and our expectations have been quite lowered, and our ambitions have been lowered. And also not the largeness of the man and the bigness of Maximus and all that stuff is ridiculous. It's really, there is, I think you get it in that Dorn clip that I played for you, a real sense of grandeur, a real sense of human grandeur, what might be possible, what is possible in the everyday, what is possible in the actuality of the everyday. And so it's something I began to think about. And so I began to think about how do I, how have I thought through Olson's work? And it has been very present, and I will show you another visual here, which some of you may recognize. Okay, so that's a house that my family used to rent right across from the studio on Rocky Neck. That is a 1951 Hudson to the right, and that is in the garage, which was my father's studio, my baby carriage. Okay, so that's taken circa 1956, I think, 56 or 57. So, I obviously have very close ties to this place. On the other hand, that's very strange because I was born in this country completely by chance. My parents came as immigrant refugees in 1951. I could have been in Italy, I could have been in any number of places, Latin America, Canada, whoever would have taken them. So that is something I've also thought quite a bit about in relation to thinking about different generations of how do we call them? Immigrants, explorers, refugees, a whole host of things. There's a wonderful insight in at Lost and Found. We've published a number of the Buffalo Olson lectures, some of the unpublished ones. So we did Diane de Prima's, and Diane has a wonderful insight here, I think, in her Olson lecture, where she talks about being in Gloucester and going back to hang out with Charles. And he says, once back in the house, our talk turned to other coils and passages of history. Charles spoke of Sunday journeys with his father through the New England countryside. They would stop by the side of the road just to look at old New England pewter in the windows, how beautiful it was to him. There was for me in his telling the forever feeling of the immigrant staring in at the culture of the land he has arrived in, and something of the proverbial kid nose pressed against the window of the candy store, a sense of Charles's hunger for American history, how it was a thing he stood forever outside of, no matter how immersed he might become in its politics, in his studies, in his great poem Maximus. That's kind of extraordinary, and that's kind of insight that only Diane would be able to come up with. It's so acute and it's so particular, and it's so much based also on her own Italianness, which is again like second generation. So I want to. There's a lot I want to try to say, and I'm not sure if it's all going to get said. But let's see if we can. Let's see where we go. So, as I'm sure you all know, in 1944, Charles Olson left the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C., where he had been working under the Roosevelt administration. And in my book, A Little History, there is this clip from the New York Times. AP, 2OWI aides resign, Poulos and Olson charge interference, but director denies it. Old story. May 18th, Constantine Poulos and Charles Olson of the Office of War Information's Foreign Language section resigned today with the assertion that George W. Healy Jr., OWI domestic director, had, quote, hamstrung the activities of their division. Mr. Healy quickly issued a statement declaring the claim untrue. Of course, it was untrue. Anyways, what they were saying was that the work that they were doing, and I would say in the realm of propaganda, I would say that what the area that he was working in at the time, I would call that kind of soft propaganda, really, in many ways. Now, what was happening in 1944 is the OWI began to make all kinds of deals as the Axis was being defeated. They made all kinds of deals to bring in various scientists and technical people and other people to the US. Some of them, under other normal circumstances, would be considered war criminals, but they essentially became the people who constructed who were in many ways, the basis of the Cold War, the Cold War intellectual infrastructure, you could say, in a way. And, Charles began to visit Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth's, which is a very important episode in how our culture has been constructed, okay? Because Pound was one of the few Americans who was supposed to be tried for treason for some speeches that he gave over Mussolini's radio station during the war, okay? And Charles went to visit him, Diane also went to visit him, many people went to visit Pound, and he was housed in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which, by the way, is now the headquarters of Homeland Security, which is quite amazing. You can't make this stuff up. Anyways, the encounter at St. Elizabeth's by Catherine Seeley, which contains all that material, Charles's notes and accounts of those visits, is a very important and extraordinary document, I think. Anyways, he wrote a text called "This is Gates Speaking," in which he kind of put himself in the voice of great cultural figures who had in many ways become quite authoritarian at the time. And he was asking questions like, in a way, the question he was asking was, through Yates, what authority do you have to counter the authority that I am proposing? Okay, and it's a question that still remains with us, with the difference between authoritarian and authority. Okay, when somebody has authority, where does it come from? As opposed to just do it, obey, or else, So during the pandemic, I wrote a text. I was invited by a magazine called Jewish Currents to write something about a poem. They said, a poem that you've been thinking about during the pandemic. I said, okay, I'm going to try this one out. I actually had been thinking quite a bit about Ezra Pound's canto on Usury, okay, which comes early on in the cantos. And I will show you this. I'll tell you the story behind it after I read the text. There, okay. So I wrote this text. I'm going to read this, it's brief. And the editor said, well, okay, but how come you're not calling Pound a fascist or an anti-Semite? And I said, I'm not going to do that. I mean, people can look it up, that's not my point. And it felt like a loyalty pledge. And I was saying, well, no, you could figure that out. So they didn't publish it. And it was published online with dispatches from the Poetry Wars that Mike Baine and Kent Johnson and I and a bunch of other people were involved in, Andre Spears. And then I got an email from a guy in Georgia, not southern Georgia, but Tbilisi, Central Asia, who had been reading my work, and he said, I want to translate this text. And I said, of course, go ahead. And then he sent me the response of an older, very well-known poet in Georgia to this text, a guy named Dato Barbakadze. And he said, we want to make a book around this text. And we want to get a bunch of poets to do different translations of it and write commentary, and we'll publish your text. So this is the cover of that book, which came out, and you can see this gorgeous orthography alphabet that is Georgian. So this to me was fabulous. You know, it's like there is sentient life on the planet. You know, it's like these people got it and picked up on it and were very enthused by it. So I just want to read this text and then go on. Now, if, some of you may know this text, but basically it's a very poetic poem, if I could put it that way, about not a very pretty subject, which is interest, you know, and what it does to people. This very notable canto by Ezra Pound has been with me for a long time, and I found myself coming back to it again and again during the ongoing pandemic, particularly as politicians roll out various figures in the trillions, and bankers and corporations lick their chops at the idea of a virtually endless supply of newly printed money and the ensuing financial chicanery that will transfer even more wealth to even fewer people. The idea that private banks exert such enormous leverage on society through charging interest for the use of currency is a practice that outraged Pound and that he felt to be one of the primary roots of the perversion and loss of value in the human community. Whatever one might think about that, the line, "Usury slayeth the child in the womb," is actually quite literal, since the ability to use or borrow funds affects the very possibility of life. Think of IMF restructuring, followed by bread riots in the so-called developing world, or redlining to prevent the accumulation of wealth by African Americans, to mention just a few obvious examples. If one thinks of interest as a means of social engineering, almost like a thermostat that can be set to have the kinds of sweeping effects that a famine or a war might have, suddenly our perspective shifts, as interest rates can actually determine the fates of whole peoples or a whole generation. Pound was famously captured in Italy in May of 1945, interrogated by an agent assigned by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, then imprisoned in a 6-by-6-foot outdoor steel cage at a US Army training center in Pisa, and eventually charged with treason for radio broadcasts he had made in support of Mussolini. In the cage at Pisa, as Pound wrote in Canto 80, quote, "The raft broke and the waters went over me," unquote. What rarely gets told in this complex story is that while Pound was one of the few American citizens charged with treason following World War II, during the same month, May of 1945, key Nazi officers, intelligence personnel, and scientists were quietly shipped to Washington, D.C., having been recruited by the burgeoning U.S. national security state to eventually serve in a series of operations with macabre and absurd names like Overcast, Paperclip, Pajamas, Dwindle, Apple Pie, Panhandle, Credulity, and Sunrise. In other words, while Pound, never having actually been put on trial, remained incarcerated at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a building now partially used as the headquarters of Homeland Security, people that under different political circumstances would have rightfully been considered war criminals became key players in US Cold War policy and its clandestine operations that assassinated leaders, destroyed peoples and economies, and ensured the hegemony of the American empire and the US dollar. In the present context, as politicians of all stripes grandstand and go to great lengths to cover their collective asses, we would do well to consider basic questions of ground. On whose ground does authority rest? In what is it vested? Beyond the hysteria and narcissism that characterizes the whole spectrum of our official current political discourse, where do we, the people, even find representation? For myself, as unfashionable as it might be, returning to Pound's cantos has proven a revelatory and unsettling source. So, though I have no proof, I'm convinced that Olson must have had wind of this, and when he left the Office of War Information, and he understood certain things about Truman. I think that you know, is hinted at here and there, but never explicitly stated. And I think that that is really one of the real, whether it was, you know, whether you had actual total knowledge of it, it was a sense. Things were changing drastically. We were going to be in a very different world very quickly. And I think it is one of the real ground reasons why, from that point on, is really striving. First of all, the first project that is in the 40s is Red, White, and Black, okay, which is a study of this continent, obviously through indigenous peoples, through white settlers, and through enslaved peoples come. Okay, and you know, the thing that amazes me about Olson's prescience and intuition, and as Peter says in his preface, accuracy. He learned his scholarship very well in his training. However, whatever uses it was put to, he understood something when he bumped into it. This kind of scholarship really doesn't get done until 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, he's really, 30 years ahead of his time in that thinking. The scholar that comes to mind for me is Jack D. Forbes, who wrote a brilliant, brilliant book, the best single book, as far as I'm concerned, on understanding race in this country, called Africans and Native Americans, which is a very detailed look at the changing nomenclature for skin color from late Roman times through the 18th and 19th century, and the politicization of color. And it's absolutely brilliant and very helpful to understand things. Anyway, so there's red, white, and black. Then there is the dual project, which is the Yucatan, the Mayans, and Iraq. Okay, and he did apply for Fulbright in 1951 to try to go to Iraq, and did not get it. And my contention is, had he gotten it, we wouldn't be in the world that we're in. So obviously, those things were already. Keep in mind, 1953, the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, the first successful CIA thing, followed by PB's success in Guatemala, the overthrow of Arbenz in 56, and so on and so forth. Now, while there's been some, I don't think, very useful or intelligent, dismissal of some of the work that Charles did in the Yucatan, that has changed quite radically in the last few years, and has changed particularly through the work of Dennis Tedlock's wonderful Olson Codex. Okay, and what Dennis Tedlock did, Dennis was one of the great interpreters of those traditions. He translated the Popol Vuh and the Rabin al-Basha, and is somebody who you can say, yes, Dennis Tedlock was an authority. He was not an authoritarian, he was an authority. And he credited, he credited Olson with being the one who spurred him into that work, as in many ways did the great British scholar of indigenous cultures, Gordon Brotherston, whose classic book, The Book of the Fourth World, is a masterpiece, an encyclopedic work, just a tremendous book. So the Olson Codex came out by Dennis, and more recently, a very wonderful book by a guy named Edgar Garcia at the University of Chicago, a book called Signs of the Americas, a poetics of pictography, hieroglyphs, and quipu. And he's quite explicit. He says, the interesting thing is that the decipherment of the Mayan glyphs was also a Cold War issue. Okay, it was also a Cold War issue, and the glyphs were cracked by Russian scholars. Actually, the first scholars who cracked them were Russians. Knorosov and a woman who was at the FOG that Charles actually was aware of and had read her work, Tatiana Pruskaryarov. And what I find, again, amazing is in the Mayan letters here, the letters to Creeley that depict this whole episode, okay? Part of the issue was the classic Mayanists didn't think that these people were capable of creating a pictorial and phonetic language, so they kind of projected it as it must be symbolic and blah, blah, blah. And Olson, from the get-go, said, no, this is a language. This is a language, and it must be connected to the language that people are speaking. Just as his initial impetus when he went to the Yucatan was, it has to be done topographically. You can't just look at one ruin here or one ruin there. You have to look at the whole area to see why they settled in these places. Well, how far are they from the water? Where you know, how are they situated? How are they distributed? All kinds of insights that only later came to be. And this guy Garcia really, very, very significantly, I think, there's a whole chapter on that, and it's really very good. It's really very good. But I want to quote from this letter to Creeley by Charles, which is from March 22nd, 1951, from Lerma. He says, of course, I balk at same. He's talking about the whole nomenclature of racial categorization, okay? And you know, who's capable of what and all those kinds of things. He says, of course I balk at same, or at least resist, simply because I take it racism has to be kept at the end of a stick, okay? Just one of the great quotes. Or put it this way, until we have completely cleaned ourselves of the biases of Westernism, of Greekism, until we have squared away historical time in such a manner that we are able to see Sumer as a point from which all, quote, races, unquote, speaking of them culturally, not biologically, egressed, we do not have permission to weight the scale one way or another. And he goes on, you know, until the lads can verify that the Chinese, as well as the people of India, came off from the Tigris-Euphrates complex, they better lie low with their jumps to conclude that only the Caucasian type was the civilizing type. As you know, this whole modern intellectual démarche has at its roots a negative impulse deeper even than the anti-Asian colonialism of Europe. At root, the search is to unload, to disburden themselves of Judaism, of Semitism. I'm not sure if I fully agree with that, but he's certainly got a point. Anyways, it's fascinating to me that, for instance, just as anecdotally, a student of mine gave me who's writing a really interesting dissertation, but she gave me an article that was on Langston Hughes and Charles Olson, which obviously interested me. And it was an interesting article, but the end conclusion of the writer, I can't remember who it was an academic article, said that Olson had no interest in race. I read that and I said, whoa, wait a second. This is a peer-reviewed article that passed through readers who approved it. So such a basic fact, you know, where Olson was actually obsessed with race. It's all over the Maximus poems. We did a thing at the Poetry Project for Amiri Baraka in Place a couple of years ago, and I did a whole walkthrough of the Maximus poems and the whole thing about which houses were, you know, where was the wealth coming from? You know, the cargo they brought back was black, quote from the Maximus poems. All these things that come up again and again and again, and how very sensitive Olson was to those things. So again, this is a kind of, anyways, I'll stop there with that. So, okay, so we've got this idea that he wanted to go to Iraq after going to the Yucatan, and the idea of putting these two very big origins together, the origins of this continent, in the indigenous world, and you know what has been until pretty recently, I think, still we are living the remnants of it, I think, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But you know, the agricultural cumulative city-state of Mesopotamia, you know, which began to be destroyed in the Gulf War and continued to be so in the following Iraq wars. So, you know, I think it's remarkable that Olson had that scope, that vision, that ability to encompass, and that's also what I mean by grandeur, that ability to see a commonality, a human commonality, and to participate in it. It's very empowering. It's a very empowering writer. You know, I think we encounter so much disempowerment constantly, and he's very, very empowering in his enthusiasm and in his ability to demonstrate what can be taken into account and what needs to be taken into account. And in many ways, that comes back to his, you know, one of his great teachers, really, the geographer Carl Sauer, whose base principle was, you know, at some level, whatever you're thinking about, you have to take all of human time into account, you know. And so you get a very different perspective as you do that. You know, you get a very different perspective. So you have, you know, a text by Carl Sauer, like, you know, the survivors of the Ice Age. That's, you know, heavy duty stuff. That's, I mean, we don't have eyewitnesses, but in a sense, there are bones, you know. So they do serve as eyewitnesses. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time.
It's 1:57.
1:57, and we started at 1. Well, I want to say a few more things. Okay, so I guess what I want to say is, oh, there's a lot to say. You know, to get back to the pound business. Okay, one of the problems that we live under increasingly is the idea that everything is administered. Okay, everything is administered. I went out for a pizza with my son the other day. We had a box in the car, and I opened the box, and there's a friggin', you know, directive from the FDA. You know, like, do not keep the pizza out of the refrigerator for more than 3 hours. If you reheat the pizza, reheat it to whatever, 165 degrees. Oh my God, you know, that's like, you know, that's like also when he says, you know, in the future you're going to have to put pictures of fish on the Gordon's boxes because people won't know what they're eating. So, you know, essentially, you know, I don't think people are inherently stupid. The opposite, they're made stupid by this kind of bullshit, you know. And it's continual, and it's surround sound, and it's nonstop. But culturally speaking, okay, the case of Ezra Pound was very important because what it did was it split politics and aesthetics in this country, and it created these two branches where some people said, well, it doesn't matter that he was a fascist, it's fine, he was a great poet, okay? Some people said, well, no, he was a fascist, you know, it doesn't matter if his poetry was great. Okay, so there you have it. It's like, boom, this way, that way. Can't hold two contradictory things in your hand at the same time. Okay, and that is an ongoing, deep, deep aim of propaganda. Okay, it's either this or that. You can't hold contradictory things at the same time. And that is very debilitating to creativity, to thought, to rationality, to doing anything, really. It's very debilitating, okay? So I just want to say something about what I've been doing and what, you know, how much I think about how much of a source and a resource Charles Olson's work is for me. So while he spent like 6 months in the Yucatan and then came back to teach at Black Mountain, you know, the students raised the money. It was like $100 to get him back, and then the salary was grand. You know, I think it was also like $100 or something. And you know, that was that kind of. I ended up, you know, as I said, kind of. I guess the old world's pull was stronger on me, that magnetic force, whatever that continental magnetic force that exists, having just been, you know, literally 5 years on this continent, you know, or my family having only been on this continent 5 years and then being born, ended up spending about 8 years, mainly in Jerusalem, but in other places as well. And out of that, all kinds of work emerged, like all kinds of work. A big book called After Jews and Arabs, which again is completely inspired by an Olsonian kind of scholarship. You know, it you know, it appeared to be an academic book, but it isn't at all. It's a poet's book. I recently very happily published, that book had a very long bibliography, and the publisher didn't have space for the bibliography. So that bibliography sat for, 20 years. And I just recently published it with a wonderful publisher called Punctum Books. And I wrote a preface called The Poetics of Bibliography, which I'm really happy with. I feel like it's one of the, in many ways, it's a kind of part of an intellectual autobiography in which I did not have anybody real or proverbial looking at me from behind, looking over my shoulder. And I do rely quite a bit on Charles's bibliography for Ed Dorn, which was essentially an assignment that he gave to Ed Dorn as a student. And that's something that I encountered as a teenager. And I always thought, that's a bibliography, I mean, if you give that to somebody, say, what is this? Is this a bibliography? I mean, it's got books in it. It also has diagrams and commentary and all kinds of things. But I want to read just the end of this. And I think that, again, there was a lot more I wanted to say, but I think we'll probably end with this. This is, and it's fitting because we're in this museum and the archive, and again, I just wanted to point out, I did work here on Vincent Ferrini in the archive when Fred and Stephanie were here, and that was revelatory. I mean, I knew Vincent from the time I was born, and Vincent was my first poetry person. I started corresponding with Vincent when I was a teenager. And going into the archive and finding his correspondence and things, it opened a whole new Vincent for me, And we ended up doing a project called Before Gloucester, okay, because we were looking at Vincent right before he came to Gloucester, when he was being harassed by HUAC, when he had all these union problems at work and so forth. And it opened up a whole world. It was extraordinary. There was a letter in there from a guy. He corresponded with a guy who was responsible for creating the plastic coating on milk cartons and on frozen food. And this guy was from Chicago, and he was a leftist activist. He worked at a newspaper, the Chicago Star, which was run by Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis was an African-American poet who ended up moving to Hawaii when he was being hounded by HUAC. And in those exchange of letters, there's a whole thing about this guy talking about going out one night to a performance, to a reading where all these people showed up. Gwendolyn Brooks showed up, and all these other people showed up. And then they went to a theater afterwards where Paul Robeson came. And the perspective of this guy was, oh, finally, a big shot comes to our theater. We've been trying to get these people to help the community for years. And finally they show up, and it's unbelievable. So here you have Vincent sitting in Gloucester, connected to these people. And that was sitting in the boxes, in the archive. So I just want to end with this piece here. This is the end of this, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Old Scholarship and Its Future. This is the end of this Poetics of Bibliography. As present conditions spectacularly move us into a future that jettisons more and more of the past, the activation of old scholarship remains a huge issue in the continuing transmission of knowledge and the sustainability of human relations outside models of consumption. Like the untapped energies of magnetic fields envisioned and made active by Nikola Tesla, progenitor of electricity as we know it, our archives, libraries, personal collections, and memories contain vast resources that generally remain hidden, off-site, hard to access, intimidating. In the spirit of accessibility, the publication of this bibliography is an example and a record, an example of the kind of gathering that can create a new field of force, and the record of a struggle that, at least for the time being, ended in defeat, but nevertheless may have much to demonstrate. The struggle depicts a historical juncture in which the political agency of a group of people, particularly identified by their geographical and chronological commonality, embroiled in an untenable set of political constraints, made valiant attempts to mobilize themselves on the basis of the memory of that history. This is, of course, not an uncommon phenomenon, but one that in fact is ever present across many historical junctures and moments, from uprisings and movements to revolutions and even counter-revolutions. In Charles Olson, the last lectures, a group of faithful students took notes, since Olson did not want to be recorded, and one of the key concepts he returned to again and again is what he called the new illiteracy. At one point he says, in our post-pre-literate period, you must get close to illiterate to be a human being. I'll read that again. In our post-pre-literate period, you must get close to illiterate to be a human being. Maybe his wish not to be recorded was also a means of forcing his students to face this very condition. One of the last notes transcribed reads as follows. If you condition yourself to approach the mythology, poetry, in words and letters and alphabets, and the materials on which they are inscribed, like you would a tree or a rock or a god, then you will have directed yourself toward the future. How exactly are we to interpret this oddly prescient approach? As I've learned from my son's work in theoretical physics, cosmology, and natural philosophy, the cosmos is a place of infinite potential. It is only the imposed scarcity of planet Earth under relatively more recent human reign that has made us think otherwise. But as this reign becomes ever more rapacious, cataclysm seems inevitable. As the excesses of a technological civilization geared only towards pure extraction hurtle us toward mass die-offs, perhaps indigenous peoples and those who have remained closer to the earth will salvage something out of the rubble. We can get some sense of this in a completely different context from the great geographer Carl Sauer's The End of the Ice Age and its Witnesses, a text that was very important for Olson in his embrace of Sauer's insistence that to locate any particular event, we must attempt, as faithful as we can, to consider, quote, the earth in all the time of human existence, unquote. Thanks. So, I'll take questions as long as they're not too hostile. Yeah, Mary,
Is it okay if I take this off?
please.
We also, you can, mobile. Oh, that's a little less German, yeah. But I couldn't be less German. Had so many shots and plus COVID. That was really very wonderful web spinning. Thank you so much. But I wanted to ask you, I'm sorry, there's a visual trail of symbols going by my eyes. I wanted to ask you, because you're feeling bereft, understandably, and diminished by the passing of all these people. I'm thinking of another old guy who I think operates like you, Peter Dale Scott.
Oh, yeah.
Who I know well and have written about, and
I'm a huge admirer.
are you a huge?
Oh, yeah.
Can you say something about?
I can say something. Peter Dale Scott is an extraordinary person. He's a poet and a scholar and a muckraker of very major importance, who really conceptualized the idea of deep politics in his landmark book, Deep Politics and the Assassination of JFK. And he's also an expert witness on arms trading, oil, and drugs, which are basically the way, the way cash travels around the world. I mean, why is the border open? Because we need cash. That's the story. Anyways, Peter Dale Scott is tremendous.
It's interesting to me that you're both medievalists like me, and you're both muckrakers, and you're both poets for whom somehow pound is actually truly meaningful. That was really, really interesting to hear you spin a bit on that most sort of charged of all pound texts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Other questions?
I've been doing, I'm a cartoonist, And so I deal with words and pictures. And I've been thinking about, I used to work here at the archives with Peter and Fred Buck and Stephanie. And Peter and I used to talk about things, and then I read one day, you know, these things you read all the time. And it said, what is the most widely used language now in the world? And it turns out it's emojis. And I thought about that, and I bought that book, the Codex book. And I'm thinking about this, and I wonder what that means for the future of language. I don't know if that's a question.
Well, yeah, it sure is. Yeah, no, I think you're onto something. I don't know, I mean, I think that this thing that I read there about the new illiteracy is fascinating, because everybody is
Well,
constantly.
don't you also think that the memes, the proliferation of memes, which I am a big part of, including the world of memes, I'm told. And Leary was on to memes, and he thought that this was a kind of an extension. It's an extension of cartooning. I mean, cartooning is just words and pictures, whether it's a joke or not.
Sure.
Up to you. So I'm fascinated by all this, and of course, Olson once again hits the nail on the head. He sees these things and he sees it for what it is, whereas the experts don't get it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, that the most, in terms of lineage, the real, remaining truly Olsonian poet is Ed Sanders. And he's working in glyphs.
Yeah.
Both his own and real glyphs.
Exactly.
So. Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
I mean, we're in an interesting time for language itself.
Yeah, thanks for that.
So we actually have two questions coming from online. There have been lovely people calling in from all over the place.
Cool.
So thanks to all our online guests.
Where?
I'll scroll back through and let you see. But Andrew Levy asked to reflect a little further on your reading of Agabem. Thank you very much. In relation to where we are in our relationship to the past and where you feel we are now.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand that. Because I know Andrew, I think I know where he's going with that, but I don't know specifically. I mean, I guess what struck me in reading those texts by Agamben was, okay, I just mentioned Ed Sanders. Okay, Ed Sanders has an extraordinary book on the death of RFK. Okay, which is Tom Beach has drawings, drawings with it. And there's a poem. What's really interesting about that book is it's about 400 plus pages, I think. About 250 or more pages just take place at the event. Okay, so it's about 3/4 of the book is over the period of maybe half an hour. But there's a lot of history coming to that half an hour. Okay, so it's very compressed. But it's very dramatic, and there's also, Ed has translated this, RFK's favorite passage from Aeschylus, as part of a new chapter that's going to be in the paperback edition. Anyways, why do I say this? Because Agamben is talking about, I do believe he, if I'm not mistaken, he references various, literary, historical, tragic circumstances, Trojan War, whatever, various big deaths, of ritualistically speaking. And I think in some sense he's trying to say, well, we have our own rituals. What happens when you just dispense with them? Like, what happens, So I don't think he's necessarily talking about the past. It's very immediate. It's like last week, no, you can't do this anymore. But I just did it, and so then what happens with that abrupt change? And And again, when I mentioned being, in constant touch with his friend in Gaza, I mean, they were not, okay, when they were getting bombed in May, COVID was not interrupting their burials, They were hauling body parts off and trying to mourn them, So it's something to keep in mind, So anyways, Andrew will continue that conversation. Thanks for the question.
All right, we have one more online, and I think one in the audience here. D. Wellman said, how do you, Ammiel, deal with Olson's final and pronounced loathing of Pound?
I don't know if it's final and pronounced. I mean, I think, they saw each other in Spoleto. I don't think Pound was very communicative, but I think he exuded something. I think it's more complicated than that. Of course, I get the antipathy, but I don't. It's a complicated matter. I don't think you can go one way or the other. I mean, I think he's still, one of the things that to me is very interesting and has been very important in my own work is that during the time that he's in Yucatan and he's looking at these glyphs, he's thinking about the examples of Pound and of William Carlos Williams in terms of how do you write a long poem and what's your relationship to, the world that you're depicting. And he finds in different ways, both of them wanting, and this is kind of what propels him towards Maximus, I think. And that's very useful to think about because in my book, From the Warring Factions, I also have thought a lot about, what does this constitute, this long poem? What are the materials? What is it in relation to? What gets taken into account? So I think, I don't know. I hear you, Don, but I don't think it's that simple. So, yeah.
Thank you. Is there one more maybe from the audience here? Any more questions today? All right. Well, we'll leave it at that, and I'm sure you can.